Fedspeak is taking on a new layer of importance in the aftermath of last week's so-called hawkish skip. And there's plenty to keep an ear out for. St. Louis Fed President Jim Bullard spoke at the Barcelona School of Economics this morning. New York's John Williams and Vice Chair Michael Barr, they're both set to speak at the New York Fed's 2023 Governance and Culture Reform Conference. The big event comes tomorrow. Chair Jay Powell appears before Congress for the semi-annual monetary policy report. That is a two-day testimony. On weeks like this, where there's a lot of Fed speak, who should investors really be focusing in on? Joining us now is Kyle Campbell, American banker, staff writer. I mean, there's the obvious that they should be paying attention to Jay Powell himself.
Of course.
But also, there are a lot of other Fed speakers. And you get this sort of wax and wane of which ones are seen as being most influential, aside from the Fed chair himself. What do people need to know?
Well, John Williams, as you said, is going to be speaking today, not necessarily about the economy per se, but he always makes a point to sprinkle in something about sort of a macro outlook. And he's been in the Fed system for a long time, previously ran the San Francisco Fed, and now he's with the New York Fed, which is a particularly important cog in the Fed machine because they're handling a lot of the actual actions that the implementation of monetary policy. So he's going to be sort of seeing how those are. He might get some of the earliest reads of how that's playing out. So you have to listen to him. And a voice that I think is important on anything sort of macroeconomic related is Christopher Waller. Now, he's only been on the Fed since 2020, but with the way the Fed Board of Governors works, there's always some level of turnover. And he's now the most senior individual with a pure economics background. And you heard him last week on Friday really hammering home the point that the Fed is not going to let some wobbles here and there in the economy throw them off, and he said specifically, just because some banks aren't handling rising interest rates well, it's not going to stop the Fed from hiking. So he's, I'd say one of the more vocal, quote unquote, hawks on the board.
And it looks like he's set to speak on Thursday at a conference held by the Central Bank of Ireland. That's
right. He'll be giving some brief remarks, and I would anticipate that those are going to be similarly hawkish.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So those are some of them. I don't see Bostic on the calendar, and he has been pinpointed by some as one of these voices that people should be listening to.
Sure, yeah. He's certainly someone who speaks quite a bit. He's not on the FOMC, which means he doesn't.
He's not a voting member.
He's not a voting member this time around. He's back on in 2024. But of course, he's in the room. He's someone who is participating in the summary of economic projections. So he's someone to listen to, certainly. And he's been in the news lately for some other things as well. Something I reported on last week was some issues with his disclosures around personal finances.
Yes, which is not the first time that has happened.
That's right.
For him. I do want to circle back around to Powell, though, because obviously there are all these voices, but he is the most important voice. After the press conference last week, what do we expect from him? What do we expect members of Congress to really zero in on?
Yes. So they're going to be sort of hammering home on this question of, why pause if you're projecting at least one more raise, if not two? And that idea of perhaps two more raises comes from that summary of economic projections. So he's going to have to explain that a little bit more. And he's also going to have to do some convincing to the markets that, that they actually are going to be aggressive. I think there's some skepticism that the economy is going to go on the course that the Fed is projecting. I think some are expecting things to slow down much quicker than the Fed has indicated, and therefore maybe there will only be one more hike or perhaps none. And this is actually, this skip is going to be a sort of a long jump to whatever is next. So we're going to see Powell sort of making the case for why markets should not expect that and why they should be ready for some more changes during the next FOMC meeting.
As somebody who has covered Powell, one of our earlier guests observed that when he makes a speech that doesn't have people asking him questions, his message tends to be clear. When he's in a room with journalists, for example, who start asking him questions, he is by nature, according to Steve Sosnick, who of Interactive Brokers, who we talked to earlier, sort of conciliatory, or at least doesn't want to be rude, perhaps. So would you agree with that assessment? And how does that then play out when he's facing members of Congress?
There is, I think, some truth in the fact that things have to change when he gets opened up to questions, because the Fed is a consensus-driven entity, and so he's trying to wrangle all the different perspectives that are on, the board and on the FOMC. So I think when the questions come out, that's when he has to sort of try to adjust his very well manicured, prepared statements and try to make them inclusive. And so I think we are going to see that happening this week, both in the House and in the Senate. And I think what's sort of important is that it's worth reading into, but also I think that it's worth considering that he's acting on his feet, and maybe what he says is not sort of final. I think there's always an indication or an inclination to say, well, whatever is said by Powell is gospel, but it's always going to be sort of open to some
You mean the market shouldn't be on a hair trigger every time he opens his mouth?
Maybe not a hairpin, yeah.
Perish the thought. All right, thanks so much. It's good to see you, Kyle. Thanks so much. Kyle Campbell, American Banker staff writer.